Over the next couple of days, we're going to be looking at China during the medieval era. But in order to understand Chinese society during that time period, we really need to get a better idea of what China was like in the earlier years, because the roots of modern and even medieval China lie in the ancient and classical eras. China is probably the world's oldest continuous culture. The seeds of society that last all the way into the 20th century and beyond were planted long before the medieval era that we're going to be talking about. And so rather than jump in 589 of the Common Era, we're going to start tonight by looking a little bit at the early history of China and getting a better sense of who these. Settlement in China began several thousand years before the Common Era, when people settled in what they called the Huang He, or we know of sometimes as the Yellow River Valley, in what is basically the northern part of modern-day China. Groups began to settle there. They formed clans and began to develop a society which only later really evolved into genuine civilization. The settlers around the Huang He River eventually coalesced and began to form civilizations. And the first of the civilizations that we really can identify is a group called the Xia. The Xia are a little bit problematic for us, though, because they're really almost semi-mythical. There's so many things we don't know about them. There's stories about them that may or may not be true, minimal evidence that has survived. We know the people existed, but there's a lot we don't know about who they were and how they really lived. But a couple of really important concepts came out of the era of the Xia people. One of the first and most important was new concepts of leadership. The original king of the Xia was a guy by the name of Yao. And when Yao was getting older and getting ready to die and pass on the mantle of leadership, he passed it on to a man by the name of Shun. What was notable about this is that Shun was not his son or any other relative. Rather, Shun was selected by Yao as his successor because Shun was morally virtuous. And that idea that leadership should be passed on to people who have virtue, that leaders should be moral, is a concept that stays with the Chinese literally to today. Virtuous leadership is terribly important in Chinese society, and it dates back to this group. The other thing that the Xia got involved with was the practice of divination, and that too lived on after them. Divination was the practice of asking the gods for guidance or answers to questions, and they did that through the use of tortoise shells. The people of the Xia dynasty would engrave a question on a tortoise shell, a simple yes-no type question. Is tomorrow the right day to launch the invasion? And they would then put that shell in the fire. It would heat and eventually crack, and then in whatever way one does this, the Xia would read those cracks to get an answer to their question. Yes, you should launch the invasion. No, you should not, whatever the case may be. And they could save those shells and ultimately determine whether the answers had been good over the years. That was important because the key here is actually not that you ask the question of the gods. We here on Earth can't contact the gods and ask them questions. Rather, you asked questions of your deceased ancestors, and your ancestors in turn could go to the gods and get an answer to the question and transmit it back to you by the cracks on the tortoiseshell. So the key, and what was beginning here, was the start of ancestor worship. The idea that the Chinese venerate their ancestors and value their advice, and you could determine who had the most powerful and important ancestors because they were the ones who got the best answers from the gods when contacted in this way. Eventually, the Xia gave way to a new dynasty, a group called the Shang. And the Shang is the first, I guess we could say, historically verifiable dynasty. It was founded by a guy by the name of Shang Teng and ruled for about 600 years in China, from about 1650 BCE to about 1027. The Shang had a regular classical, pre-classical civilization, gender equity, which is a little bit unusual. Women were treated unusually well in the Shang dynasty. They were allowed to own land, they could lead armies, and so on. The other thing that the Shang did was begin to really preach the idea of respect for your elders, coming straight out of this idea of divination and contacting ancestors from the Shia, because indeed it is the elders in the family who might have known and certainly had the most direct contact with ancestors. And so you respect your elders because they have the contact with the ancestors who contact the gods and so on. The Shang really began to bring that respect for the elderly into play here. Eventually, though, in 1027 BCE, they were overthrown by a new group that was known as the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty then ruled for the better part of 800 years, from 1027 to 256 BCE. The Zhou are interesting and important not just because they maintained and grew the civilization that had begun under the Xia and even more so under the Shang, but also because of the way they explained why they overthrew the Shang dynasty in 1027 BCE. They did that because they claimed that the gods were no longer happy with the way the Shang were ruling, and therefore the Shang no longer had a mandate of heaven to rule. Rather, they said that now they, the Zhou dynasty, had been given the mantle of approval from the heavens, the mandate of heaven, and that was how they could justify overthrowing the Shang dynasty. They were the first to do that, but the concept of the mandate of heaven is one that survives literally into the 20th century. And so we are going to hear all year long of the stories about groups losing the mandate of heaven and new groups claiming the mandate of heaven and taking leadership. Understand how the mandate of heaven works. It's not that the gods directly intervene and throw somebody out of office or put somebody else on. Rather, it's tied to this idea of good and virtuous leadership and the gods communicating whether you've got good, virtuous leadership, like Yao and Shun would have approved. When leadership is good, you have balance, you have harmony in life, and everybody flourishes. But when the leadership becomes bad, when the leadership is no longer ruling capably, or they're doing things that aren't really morally right and so on, things go out of balance. There's a lack of harmony, if you will. And the gods let you know that they're unhappy and that things are no longer harmonious because you start getting floods and famines and political unrest and so on. And when we begin to see a lot of those events and they're not being well handled, it is apparent to the Chinese that the gods aren't happy, things are out of balance. This group of leaders no longer has the mandate of heaven to rule. And so somebody new takes over. And presumably, if things settle down, they've got that mandate of heaven. Now, you might argue that's a little self-serving, and I suppose on some level that even could be true, because after all, if you have problems like floods, that disrupts life, and you'll have, unhappiness with the people and so on. And whoever takes over claims they've got the mandate because they're there. What better proof could there be? So that would be a Western way of looking at that, I suppose, but the Chinese believe that this is how the gods transmit their will and let people know that it's time to change leadership, and the mandate of heaven becomes really important. Indeed, this idea of balance is one that is extremely important throughout Chinese history. We see this come up over and over again, and it really is introduced by the Zhou dynasty. The idea of harmony in nature becomes a theme throughout history, and it's well exemplified by the whole concept of yin-yang. Yin-yang, the idea of opposites and balance between the man and woman, black and white, dark and light, and so on and so forth. These various concepts that the world and the universe is one of balance and structure is really important, and the Zhou took that through into the rest of their life. They built their capital cities in balance, for example. The capital city of the Zhou dynasty was laid out in a rectangle with religious structures at the cardinal points of the city. The palace would be at the extreme north axis. The merchants and the shopping would be at the south axis. Nations of the Shang and the Zhou and so on also brought other important contributions to Chinese life that persist into the medieval and even the modern era. One of those is the introduction of calligraphy as a form of writing. calligraphy was important because the various regions of China speak different languages. The oral language is not the same from one place to the other, so the people in one area would not even be able necessarily to talk to the people in another part of China and understand each other, but they all use the identical written language. So while they might pronounce the word for pig very differently, I don't speak Chinese, but maybe in the north the word for pig is yang and the word for pig in the south is gul. Whatever the case may be, but it would be written exactly the same in calligraphy, and that is what defines who is Chinese. You are Chinese if you write calligraphy. You are not Chinese if you don't handle calligraphy. That's introduced during these early dynasties. So too are various other contributions, and there are so many of them we can't begin to cover them all. We could spend hours at that, but two of the really notable ones that are of interest and persevere over the millennia. One is the use of acupuncture and medical treatment, again going back to the flow in the body and the balance of flows in the body. The other important innovation that comes during these dynasties is the introduction of silk. And silk becomes one of the most important trade items as well as lifestyle items within Chinese society over the ensuing millennia. Silk is a wonderful fabric in the sense that it breathes, and so it's very cool to wear in the summertime, but it also insulates well, and so it keeps you warm in the winter. It's a marvelous fabric, and this becomes critical. The production of silk was not only a central occupation to the Chinese, but by the time of the Zhou dynasty, it had become a state secret. The attempt to smuggle a silkworm out of China or to tell others how to raise the silkworms and how to harvest the silk from the cocoon and so on was punishable by death. It was a capital offense to even give away the secrets. Silk will become one of the most important trade items along what becomes known